The little girl sat in the back corner of her third-grade classroom, watching raindrops race down the window. While 22 other children chatted and laughed around her, she found peace in the gentle patter of rain against glass. Her teacher, Mrs. Johnson, had long stopped trying to coax words from her during reading time. "She's just shy," the adults would whisper when they thought she couldn't hear. But it wasn't shyness that kept her quiet. Words felt heavy sometimes, like stones in her mouth. She preferred to listen, to watch, to understand the world through her eyes rather than her voice. At home in the small mountain town of Pine Valley, life moved at a different pace. The 8-year-old lived with her grandmother in a cozy house that smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 3, but she barely remembered them now. Grandma Rose was all the family she needed. Every afternoon after school, the little girl would drop her backpack by the front door and head straight to the kitchen. This was her favorite place in the whole world. The kitchen was warm and alive, filled with wonderful smells and the gentle sounds of cooking. Pots bubbled on the stove, onions sizzled in pans, and herbs hung drying from wooden beams overhead. "Come here, sweet pea," Grandma Rose would say, patting the wooden stool beside the counter. "Want to help me with dinner?" The girl would climb onto her stool and watch with careful eyes. She noticed everything. How her grandmother's hands moved when she kneaded bread dough. How she could tell when garlic was perfectly golden just by the sound it made in the pan. How she added just a pinch more salt to the soup after tasting it with a wooden spoon. "How do you know when it's ready?" the little girl asked one evening, speaking so softly her grandmother had to lean close to hear. "Your nose knows." Grandma Rose smiled, stirring a pot of vegetable stew. "And your heart knows too. Cooking isn't just about following recipes, honey. It's about feeling what the food needs." The child nodded seriously. This made perfect sense to her. She could smell when the cornbread in the oven was exactly right, could hear when the soup needed more simmering time. Her hands seemed to know how much flour to add to make biscuits fluffy, even though she'd never measured it herself. At school during lunchtime, she would observe what other kids ate. Sandwiches made with too much mayonnaise, soggy vegetables, cookies that looked pretty but tasted like cardboard. She wanted to tell them about real food, about how carrots tasted sweeter when roasted with a little honey, about how homemade soup could warm you from the inside out. But the words stayed locked inside her chest. Her classmates had learned not to expect much conversation from her. Some were kind, saving seats for her at lunch or including her in games without expecting her to talk much. Others whispered that she was weird, that something was wrong with her. Their words stung, but she had learned to let them bounce off like raindrops on a window. "She's too quiet," her teacher mentioned to Grandma Rose during a parent conference. "I worry she's not developing proper social skills. Maybe she should see someone who can help her open up more." Grandma Rose just smiled and shook her head. "That child talks plenty when she has something important to say. She's just choosy with her words, that's all. Nothing wrong with that in my book." At home that evening, the little girl helped prepare chicken and dumplings for dinner. She rolled the dumpling dough with small, careful hands while her grandmother prepared the broth. The kitchen was filled with comfortable silence, broken only by the gentle bubbling of the pot and the soft thud of the rolling pin. "Grandma," she said suddenly, "do you think I'm broken?" The old woman stopped stirring and looked down at her granddaughter with surprised eyes. "Broken? Sweet pea, what makes you ask such a thing?" "The kids at school say I don't talk enough. Mrs. Johnson thinks something's wrong with me." Grandma Rose set down her wooden spoon and knelt beside the counter, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "Listen to me, honey. There's nothing broken about you. Some people talk to fill the air with noise. Others, like you, talk when they have something worth saying. Both ways are just fine. But what if I never have anything worth saying?" "Oh, sweet pea," her grandmother laughed gently. "You say important things every day. You just don't always use words to say them." That night, as the little girl lay in her small bedroom under the eaves, she thought about her grandmother's words. Through her window, she could see the dark outline of the mountains that surrounded their little town. Somewhere up there, hidden among the pine trees and rocky slopes, other people lived different kinds of lives. She wondered about them sometimes, especially on nights when the wind carried strange sounds down from the peaks. She pulled her quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes, dreaming of kitchens filled with wonderful smells, of hands that knew exactly how to make something ordinary become extraordinary. In her dreams, she was older, standing at a big wooden table teaching others the secrets her grandmother had shared with her. In her dreams, People listened not because she talked the loudest, but because what she made with her hands spoke louder than any words ever could. The next morning brought fresh snow to the mountains, and the little girl woke to the familiar sounds of her grandmother moving around the kitchen downstairs. She dressed quickly and hurried down to find pancakes sizzling on the griddle and coffee percolating in the old metal pot. "Morning, sweet pea," Grandma Rose called without turning around. "Sleep well?" "Yes," the girl replied, climbing onto her stool. She watched as her grandmother flipped pancakes with practiced ease, each one golden brown and perfectly round. "What makes them so fluffy?" she asked. "Secret ingredient," her grandmother winked. "What is it?" "Love, honey." "Always love." The little girl smiled, understanding completely. This was the kind of conversation that made sense to her, the kind of lesson that settled deep in her bones. She might not say much to the outside world, but here in this kitchen, surrounded by warmth and wisdom, she was learning the most important language of all. 3 miles up the winding mountain trail, past where most folks from Pine Valley ever ventured, stood a small log cabin that seemed to grow right out of the forest floor. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney most mornings, the only sign that someone lived in the wilderness beyond the town's edge. The man who called this place home had been there for almost 6 years now, though time moved differently in the mountains. Days blended into weeks, seasons changed without fanfare, and the outside world felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. He had built this life deliberately, choosing solitude over the chaos he'd left behind. His name was written on old papers tucked away in a wooden box, but he rarely thought of himself that way anymore. Up here, he was just the man who split wood each morning, who tended a small garden in the summer months, who knew which plants were good for tea and which berries the deer preferred. The mountain had a way of stripping away everything that didn't matter, leaving only what was essential. The cabin was simple but comfortable. One room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a stone fireplace that kept everything warm during the long winter months. A small loft above held his bed and a few personal belongings. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of preserved vegetables, dried herbs, and the basic supplies he needed to live. Every few weeks, he would make the trip down to town for necessities: flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil. He moved quickly through the general store, nodding politely to anyone who greeted him but never lingering for conversation. The townspeople had grown accustomed to his presence, though many still whispered about the mysterious mountain man who kept to himself. Used to be somebody important, old Pete at the hardware store would tell anyone who'd listen. Big city fellow, they say. Something happened that sent him running to the hills. The stories varied depending on who told them. Some said he was running from the law, others that he'd lost his mind after a tragedy. A few claimed he'd been a famous chef who'd had a nervous breakdown after a bad review. The truth, as usual, was both simpler and more complicated than any of the stories. He had indeed been a chef once, though not famous in the way people imagined. He'd owned a small restaurant in the city, nothing fancy but well-loved by regular customers who came for hearty meals and friendly conversation. Cooking had been his passion since childhood, a way of bringing people together and creating something beautiful from simple ingredients. But success had changed things. The restaurant grew busier, the demands greater. He'd hired more staff, expanded the menu, started staying later and later each night to perfect every dish. The joy had slowly leaked out of cooking, replaced by stress and pressure and the constant worry that he wasn't good enough. Then came the night that changed everything. A young couple celebrating their anniversary had ordered his signature dish, braised lamb with rosemary potatoes. Something had gone wrong, though he never figured out exactly what. Food poisoning, the doctor said later. The woman had become violently ill, spent 3 days in the hospital, nearly died. It wasn't his fault, everyone told him. These things happen sometimes despite all precautions. The health department found no violations in his kitchen. Insurance covered the medical bills. The couple even wrote him a letter saying they held no hard feelings. But he couldn't shake the image of the woman's pale face as the ambulance took her away. Couldn't stop replaying every step of preparing that meal. What if he'd missed something? What if his pursuit of perfection had made him careless with the basics? What if his food, the thing he'd dedicated his life to, could hurt people? Within a month, he'd sold the restaurant and everything in it. He'd bought this land site unseen, attracted by its remoteness and the promise of silence. He'd come here to disappear, to find peace in a life where the only person he could hurt was himself. The first winter had been brutal. He'd underestimated how hard it would be to live alone in the mountains, how the cold could seep into his bones, how the endless silence could feel oppressive rather than peaceful. More than once he'd considered giving up and returning to civilization, but gradually he'd found his rhythm. He learned to read the weather and the behavior of birds, to find comfort in the sound of wind through pine trees. He discovered which wild mushrooms were safe to eat, how to preserve vegetables without refrigeration, how to cook simple meals that satisfied both body and soul. His cooking changed too. Gone were the elaborate presentations and complex flavor combinations. Instead, he focused on basics: bread that rose properly, soup that warmed thoroughly, vegetables that tasted like themselves rather than like a chef's ego. Food became functional again, nourishing rather than impressive. On this particular October evening, he stood at his small kitchen window, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift past. A pot of venison stew simmered on the wood-burning stove, filling the cabin with rich, savory smells. He'd shot the deer himself earlier that week, processing the meat with the same careful attention he'd once given to exotic ingredients. The weather forecast on his battery-powered radio warned of a significant storm moving in, possibly the worst early-season blizzard in decades. He'd spent the afternoon securing his property, bringing in extra firewood, checking that his windows were properly sealed. Tomorrow he might be snowed in for several days. The prospect didn't worry him. He had enough supplies to last through winter if necessary, and he'd grown to appreciate the forced solitude that storms brought. There was something peaceful about being completely cut off from the outside world, about having no choice but to exist in the present moment. As darkness settled over the mountains, he ladled stew into a simple ceramic bowl and sat at his small wooden table. The meal was perfect in its simplicity: tender meat, vegetables from his own garden, herbs he'd dried himself. No one would review this meal. No one would judge his technique or presentation. It was just food, honest and nourishing. Outside, the wind began to howl through the trees and snow started falling in earnest. The man finished his dinner, washed his bowl in the basin, and added another log to the fire. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight he was content to listen to the storm and remember what it felt like to cook without fear, to find satisfaction in feeding just himself. He had no way of knowing that this storm would bring an unexpected visitor to his door, someone who would remind him why he'd fallen in love with cooking in the first place. For now, he simply prepared for another quiet evening alone, grateful for the peace he'd found in his mountain solitude. The storm hit Pine Valley harder than anyone expected. What started as gentle snowflakes in the early afternoon had turned into a full blizzard by evening, with wind howling down from the peaks and snow falling so thick you couldn't see across the street. Grandma Rose had planned a quick trip to Miller's General Store for supplies before the weather got too bad. "Just need a few things," she told her granddaughter over lunch. "Flour, milk, maybe some of those apples Mr. Miller gets from the valley. We'll be back before dinner time." The little girl had begged to come along. She loved the general store with its rows of glass jars filled with penny candy, its shelves stocked with mysterious canned goods from far-off places, and the way Mr. Miller always slipped her a peppermint stick when her grandmother wasn't looking. "Bundle up then," Grandma Rose had said, wrapping a thick scarf around the child's neck. "This wind's got teeth in it." They'd made it to the store just fine, the old truck's chains biting into the snowy road. But while they shopped inside, the storm had grown fierce. What had been a manageable snowfall became something wild and dangerous, turning the familiar streets of Pine Valley into a maze of white. "We should wait it out," Mr. Miller suggested, peering through the store's frosted windows. "This'll blow through by morning, but right now it's no weather for driving." Grandma Rose looked worried. She'd lived in these mountains her whole life and knew when to respect the weather, but she also knew her old truck, and how temperamental it could be in conditions like this. "Maybe you're right," she agreed reluctantly. "Let me just call Mrs. Peterson, see if she can check on the house." That's when they discovered the phone lines were down. The little girl pressed her face against the store window, watching the snow swirl and dance in the pale light from the street lamps. It was beautiful in a scary way, like nature was showing off its power. She could barely make out the truck parked just 20 feet away. "Don't worry, sweet pea," her grandmother said, though her voice carried a note of concern. "We'll just wait here until it calms down." But the storm seemed to have other plans. By 6 o'clock, it was darker outside than it should have been, and the wind was rattling the store windows. Mr. Miller had already called his wife to say he'd be staying at the store overnight. "I can make coffee," he offered. "Got some crackers and cheese, too. We'll be fine until morning." The little girl tried to be patient, but sitting still had never been her strong suit. While the adults talked about weather patterns and road conditions, she found herself drawn to the back door of the store, the one that led to the delivery area behind the building. "Just want to see how deep it is," she told herself, turning the handle quietly. The door opened into a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the building in smooth, curved shapes that looked like something from a fairy tale. The familiar alley behind the store had become an alien landscape of white hills and valleys. She stepped out just for a moment, just to feel the snow on her face and hear the wild song of the wind. But the door slammed shut behind her, and when she tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. The wind had blown snow against it, jamming it closed. "Grandma!" she called, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. She tried to walk around to the front of the store, but the snow was deeper than she'd realized. Her boots, which had seemed perfectly adequate that morning, filled with snow and made each step a struggle. The wind pushed against her like invisible hands, making it hard to keep her balance. Worse, everything looked different in the storm. The familiar landmarks of Pine Valley had disappeared under blankets of white. Street signs were buried, building shapes were obscured, and the swirling snow made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. She tried to retrace her steps back to the store, but the wind had already erased her footprints. Panic began to flutter in her chest like a trapped bird. She called for her grandmother again, but the storm seemed to grab her words and scatter them across the mountains. Fighting down her fear, she tried to think logically. The main road ran north and south through town. If she could find it, she could follow it either back to the store or toward home. But in the whiteout conditions, she couldn't tell which direction was which. She began walking what she hoped was north, toward the residential area where she and her grandmother lived. Her legs worked hard to push through the deepening snow, and her cheeks stung from the cold wind. Ice crystals formed on her eyelashes, making it even harder to see. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she realized she was no longer in town at all. The ground under her feet was sloping upward, and there were no more streetlights or building shapes to guide her. Somehow, in the confusion of the storm, she had wandered onto one of the mountain trails that led up from the valley. The trees around her were tall pines and firs, their branches heavy with snow that occasionally dumped onto the trail with soft thumping sounds. She could hear water running somewhere nearby, probably Pine Creek, which meant she was on the old logging road that wound up toward the high country. She tried to turn back, but her own tracks were already filled with fresh snow. The trail behind her looked exactly like the trail ahead, a narrow white corridor between dark trees that seemed to stretch on forever. Her feet were getting numb despite her warm socks, and her mittens were soaked through from trying to brush snow off her face. She was 8 years old and lost in a blizzard, farther from home than she'd ever been by herself, but she kept walking, partly because moving seemed better than standing still, and partly because she could see something up ahead, a faint yellow glow that didn't look natural. As she got closer, struggling up the steep trail, the glow resolved into the warm light of windows. A log cabin sat in a small clearing, smoke rising from its chimney despite the fierce wind. Snow had drifted against its walls, but the windows glowed with welcoming light, and she could smell something wonderful cooking inside. She had never been this far up the mountain before, had never seen this cabin or known anyone lived here. But right now it looked like the most beautiful sight in the world, a haven of warmth and safety in the wild storm. Her grandmother had always taught her not to talk to strangers, not to go into houses she didn't know. But she was cold and scared and completely lost, and this might be her only chance to get help. She climbed the wooden steps to the cabin's front door, her legs shaking from cold and exhaustion. Through the window, she could see a man moving around inside, setting something on a table. He looked ordinary enough, tall and thin, with dark hair and a beard. Wearing a heavy sweater, she raised her small fist and knocked on the door, the sound seeming tiny against the roar of the storm. The door opened and warm air rushed out to greet her, carrying with it the most amazing smell, something rich and savory that made her stomach growl with hunger. The man stood in the doorway, staring down at her with surprise and concern. "My goodness," he said, his voice gentle despite his obvious shock. "Child, what are you doing out in this weather? Where are your parents?" She looked up at him, snow melting on her cheeks, too cold and tired to be properly afraid. All she could think about was how warm it looked inside his cabin, and how that wonderful smell reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen on winter evenings. "I got lost," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely get the words out. "I can't find my way home." The mountain man stared at the small figure on his doorstep, his mind racing. A child alone in this storm so far from town. Snow clung to her dark hair, and her lips were turning blue from the cold. Whatever had brought her here, she needed help immediately. "Come in," he said, stepping back to make room. "Quickly now, before you freeze." She stumbled inside, her snow-covered boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. He could see she was shivering violently, and her clothes were soaked through. The cabin, which had felt perfectly warm to him, suddenly seemed inadequate against the cold that radiated from her small form. "We need to get you dry," he said, his voice gentle but urgent. He grabbed a thick blanket from the chair by the fireplace and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Sit here by the fire." "Can you tell me your name?" She sank into the wooden chair, pulling the blanket tight around herself. Her eyes were wide as she took in the cabin, the rough log walls, the simple furniture, the pot bubbling on the wood-burning stove. Everything was clean and orderly, but so different from any home she'd ever seen. I'm not supposed to tell strangers my name," she whispered, though her voice shook more from cold than fear. He nodded approvingly. "That's smart. Your parents taught you well, but I'm not going to hurt you, and we need to figure out how to get you home safely. The storm's too bad right now for anyone to travel. But once it clears up, we'll get word to your family." He moved to his small kitchen area, pulling out a ceramic mug and ladling soup from the pot on the stove. The rich smell filled the cabin, vegetables and herbs and something else that made her stomach clench with hunger. "When did you last eat?" he asked, carrying the mug over to her. "Lunchtime," she said quietly. "We went to Mr. Miller's store, but then I got lost in the storm." He knelt beside her chair, holding out the mug. "This will warm you up. Be careful, it's hot." She accepted the soup gratefully, wrapping her small hands around the warm ceramic. The first sip sent heat radiating through her chest, and she couldn't help but sigh with relief. It was the best thing she'd ever tasted, rich and complex with flavors she couldn't even name. "This is really good," she whispered, looking up at him with surprise. "What's in it?" Something in his expression softened. "Just vegetables mostly. Carrots, celery, onions, some herbs from the garden, a little bit of venison." She took another sip, closing her eyes to concentrate on the taste. "You put thyme in it. And something else. Rosemary?" He blinked, startled. Most adults couldn't identify herbs by taste alone, let alone a child this young. "Yes, both of those." "How did you know?" "My grandma teaches me about cooking," she said, her voice growing a little stronger as the warmth of the soup spread through her body. "She says food tells you secrets if you listen right." The man sat back on his heels, studying her with new interest. "Your grandmother sounds wise. Does she live in Pine Valley?" The little girl nodded, taking another careful sip. "We live on Maple Street in the blue house with the big front porch. She's probably worried sick about me." "I'm sure she is. What's your grandmother's name?" "Maybe I know her from town. Grandma Rose, Rose Peterson." Recognition flickered in his eyes. "I know her, nice lady. Always says hello when I'm at Miller's store." He stood up, moving back to the stove. "She must be frantic. Unfortunately, the phone lines are down, and this storm's not going to let up until morning at the earliest." The girl continued sipping her soup, watching him move around the small kitchen. He was preparing his own dinner, she realized, and she felt guilty for interrupting his evening. But as she watched, she found herself fascinated by the way he worked. His movements were sure and economical, never wasted. He chopped vegetables with precise, even cuts, tasted the broth with a wooden spoon, adjusted the seasoning with just a pinch of salt. Everything he did seemed purposeful and calm, like a dance he'd performed thousands of times. "You're really good at cooking," she observed, her voice still quiet but less fearful than before. He glanced over at her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I've had lots of practice. Been doing it most of my life. Were you a cook somewhere? Like in a restaurant?" The smile faded slightly, and she sensed she'd touched on something painful. "Something like that," he said simply. She finished her soup and set the mug on the small table beside her chair. The warmth had spread all the way to her fingers and toes now, and the violent shivering had stopped. For the first time since leaving the general store, she didn't feel scared. Could I help? She asked hesitantly. I help Grandma Rose all the time. I'm good at not making messes. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded toward the kitchen. I suppose I could use an assistant. Think you can manage some simple tasks? She slipped down from the chair, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders like a cloak. The kitchen area was small but well organized, with everything in its proper place. A wooden cutting board sat on the counter next to a pile of potatoes that needed peeling. I can do those, she said, pointing at the potatoes. Grandma Rose taught me how to use a paring knife safely. He handed her a small knife, watching carefully as she demonstrated her grip and technique. Satisfied that she knew what she was doing, he returned to his own prep work, cutting chunks of the remaining venison for tomorrow's meals. They worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the storm howling outside. The girl peeled potatoes with careful concentration, creating long, thin spirals of skin that curled onto the cutting board. Every few minutes she would glance over at what he was doing, absorbing his techniques without saying anything. You're very quiet, he observed after a while, but his tone wasn't critical. Most kids your age talk nonstop. She considered this, setting aside a perfectly peeled potato. I don't always have much to say, but I like watching people cook. You learn more with your eyes than with your ears, Grandma Rose says. She's right about that. Cooking is about watching and feeling and tasting. The best lessons can't be taught with words. As if to demonstrate his point, he guided her hand as she helped him add the potatoes to a pan with a little oil and butter. Feel that, he said, letting her hold the wooden spoon as she stirred. The potatoes should sizzle but not burn. Listen to the sound they make. She nodded seriously, concentrating on the gentle hissing sound from the pan. When one side of the potatoes had browned properly, she looked up at him questioningly. Now, she whispered. Now, he confirmed, and together they flipped the potatoes to brown the other side. By the time they sat down to eat, the storm outside seemed less frightening. The cabin felt cozy and safe, filled with the warm smells of their shared cooking. She ate roasted potatoes and vegetables with quiet appreciation, occasionally looking up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I don't say much, she told him as they finished eating, remembering his earlier comment about quiet children. But I make good stew. It was such a serious grown-up thing to say that he almost smiled. Instead, he nodded gravely, as if she'd shared an important piece of information. I believe you do, he said simply. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the small cabin, something had shifted. Two strangers had become something more than that. The little girl woke to the sound of wood crackling in the fireplace and something delicious cooking nearby. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The bed was unfamiliar, tucked up in a small loft that smelled of pine wood and dried herbs. Through a small window, she could see snow still falling heavily outside. Then it all came back. The storm getting lost, finding this cabin and the quiet man who lived here. She was wearing an oversized flannel shirt that must belong to him, her own clothes hanging dry by the fireplace downstairs. Good morning, came a gentle voice from below. How did you sleep? She peered over the edge of the loft to see him standing at his small stove, stirring something in a cast-iron pan. The cabin looked different in the morning light that filtered through the snow-covered windows, cozier somehow, like a place where someone had lived contentedly for a long time. Good, she called down softly. Is it still snowing? Afraid so. Looks like we might be here together for another day or two. Hope that's all right with you. She climbed down the wooden ladder carefully, still wearing the big shirt that hung almost to her knees. Her boots and socks were dry now, set neatly by the fireplace. Will my grandma be worried? I imagine she's very worried, he said honestly. But she'll also know you're smart enough to find shelter. Mountain people understand about storms. She'll know you're safe somewhere until this blows over. He was making pancakes, she realized, and the smell reminded her powerfully of home. But these looked different from Grandma Rose's, thinner, more delicate, with a golden color that suggested something special in the batter. What kind are those? She asked, coming to stand beside the stove. Just regular pancakes, but I add a little cornmeal to the flour. Makes them more interesting. He flipped one expertly, revealing a perfectly golden surface. Want to help with the next batch? She nodded eagerly, washing her hands in the basin he kept by the window. He showed her how to measure the cornmeal, how to mix it with the flour just enough to combine without overworking the batter. The secret, he said, watching her stir carefully with a wooden spoon, is to leave it a little lumpy. Smooth batter makes tough pancakes. This was exactly the kind of lesson Grandma Rose would teach her, the kind of small detail that made all the difference. She found herself relaxing, falling into the comfortable rhythm of cooking alongside someone who understood that food was meant to be treated with respect. They ate breakfast together as the storm continued outside, talking quietly about simple things: how to tell when maple syrup was pure, why cast iron pans cooked more evenly than thin ones, the best way to keep a wood fire burning steady overnight. "You know a lot for someone so young," he observed, watching her cut her pancakes into precise, even pieces. "Grandma Rose says cooking is the most important thing you can learn. Feed people well," she always says, "and you'll never lack for friends." Something flickered across his face at that, a shadow of old pain, perhaps, or regret. But it passed quickly, replaced by curiosity about this unusual child who spoke about food with such serious reverence. After breakfast, she helped him wash dishes in a basin of heated water, drying each plate and cup carefully before setting it back on the shelf. Her movements were economical and sure, the habits of someone who'd been doing these tasks for years. "Were you always this quiet?" he asked as they worked. She considered the question seriously. "I think so. Even when I was really little, Grandma Rose says I watched more than I talked. Some kids need to make noise to feel comfortable. I need quiet to think properly." He understood this completely. In his years of solitude, he'd learned the value of silence, how it could be peaceful rather than empty. Most people were uncomfortable with quiet, felt compelled to fill it with chatter. But this child seemed to inhabit silence the way fish inhabit water, naturally, without effort. By mid-morning, the cabin had grown warm from the fire and their cooking activities. He opened a window slightly to let in fresh air, and she pressed her face against the glass to watch the snow fall. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "like the whole world is being covered with a clean white blanket." "That's a good way to put it. Do you like winter?" "I love it. Everything gets quiet and peaceful. You can hear things you miss when it's busy and loud." As if to prove her point, they both stood listening to the subtle sounds around them, the soft hiss of snow against the windows, the gentle settling of logs in the fireplace, the distant call of a bird that had found shelter in the evergreen trees outside. "What do you hear right now?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. She closed her eyes and tilted her head slightly, concentrating. "The fire is burning good, not too fast, not too slow. There's water dripping somewhere, maybe from snow melting off the roof. And..." She paused, listening intently. "Something's bubbling," very quietly. He looked toward the stove in surprise. He'd put a pot of beans on to simmer hours earlier, and had forgotten about them. Sure enough, they were barely bubbling exactly as they should be. "How did you hear that? I can barely hear it myself." She opened her eyes and shrugged as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Grandma Rose says I have good ears for the kitchen. She says some people are born knowing when things are ready." The day passed peacefully. He taught her to make bread, showing her how to knead the dough until it felt smooth and elastic under her hands. She had a natural feel for it, knowing instinctively when it needed more flour or when the gluten had developed properly. "You don't measure anything," she observed, watching him add ingredients by feel rather than using measuring cups. "After a while, your hands remember better than your head. Cooking is about relationships. How flour feels with water, how salt changes sweetness, how heat transforms everything it touches. You can't measure relationships. You have to feel them." This made perfect sense to her. At home with Grandma Rose, the best meals came not from following recipes exactly, but from paying attention to what the food needed in the moment. They made soup for lunch using the last of the venison, adding vegetables he'd stored in a cool corner of the cabin. She helped him prepare everything, chopping onions until her eyes watered, stirring the pot while he adjusted the seasonings. "Taste this," he said, offering her a spoonful of broth. She sipped it thoughtfully. "It's good, but it needs something bright." He raised his eyebrows, impressed. The soup was indeed lacking a certain vibrancy, but he hadn't expected her to identify that so precisely. "What do you think it needs?" "Maybe some lemon. Or vinegar? Something to wake up all the other flavors. He added a splash of apple cider vinegar to the pot, then offered her another taste. Her face lit up with satisfaction. Perfect, she declared. They ate their lunch in comfortable quiet, each lost in their own thoughts but somehow connected by the shared experience of creating something nourishing together. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, but neither of them seemed to mind anymore. I like it here, she said finally, setting down her empty bowl. It's peaceful. Like being inside a snow globe where nothing bad can happen. He looked at her across the small table. This remarkable child who had somehow found her way to his door. In 2 days, she had brought something into his isolated world that he hadn't even realized he'd been missing. The simple pleasure of sharing food with another person, of passing on knowledge to someone who truly wanted to learn. I like having you here too, he admitted quietly. It's been a long time since I've cooked for anyone but myself. She smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her serious little face. Grandma Rose always says food tastes better when it's shared. Even if it's the same recipe, it's different when there's someone else at the table. As afternoon faded into evening and the storm continued to rage outside, they prepared dinner together with the easy familiarity of old cooking partners. She anticipated what he needed before he asked for it, handed him ingredients at exactly the right moment, stirred pots with the same careful attention he did. They were both quiet by nature, but their silence was full of communication, the wordless understanding that develops between people who work well together, who respect each other's skills and instincts. Later, as she helped him clean up after dinner, she said something that would stay with him long after she returned to her own life. You know what I think, she said, drying a wooden spoon with careful thoroughness. What's that? I think you were sad before I came here. But cooking with someone made you remember why you liked it in the first place. He stopped washing dishes and looked at her, startled by her perceptiveness. She was 8 years old, but in that moment she seemed ancient and wise, as if she could see straight through to the parts of himself he'd thought were hidden. You might be right about that, he said finally. She nodded seriously, as if this was exactly the answer she'd expected. Then she went back to drying dishes, humming softly under her breath while outside the storm continued to blanket their small world in peaceful, pristine white. Down in Pine Valley, Grandma Rose hadn't slept in 2 days. She sat at her kitchen window, watching the storm rage outside, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. Every few minutes, she would get up and pace through the small house, checking rooms where she knew her granddaughter wouldn't be, hoping somehow she might have missed something. She's smart, Rose, her neighbor Mrs. Patterson had said for the 100th time. That child of yours has more sense than most adults. She would have found shelter somewhere. But knowing it in her head and feeling it in her heart were two different things. The little girl was only 8 years old, and this was the worst storm the mountains had seen in years. The wind was howling like something alive and angry, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. At Miller's General Store, half the town had gathered to wait out the storm and organize search parties for when the weather cleared. Mr. Miller had turned his store into an unofficial command center, with people coming and going as conditions allowed, sharing information and coordinating efforts. Last anyone saw her, she was with you at the store, Sheriff, Davidson said gently to Grandma Rose. Tell me again exactly what happened. She repeated the story she'd told a dozen times already, how they'd come to the store for supplies, how the storm had worsened while they shopped, how her granddaughter had simply vanished while the adults were discussing whether to wait out the weather. She must have gone out the back door, Mr. Miller added. Found it unlocked this morning. Snow drifted right up against it. Poor little thing probably got turned around in all that white. The sheriff nodded grimly. He'd lived in these mountains his whole life and knew how quickly someone could get lost in a blizzard, especially a child who might panic and make poor choices. But he also knew the people of Pine Valley and how they came together when one of their own was in trouble. Soon as this wind dies down, we'll have every able-bodied person in town out there looking, he promised. We'll find her, Rose. We'll bring her home. By the second night, the storm had finally begun to weaken. The wind was still fierce, but the snow had slowed to occasional flurries instead of the relentless curtain it had been. Men throughout the town were checking their snowshoes and winter gear, preparing to head out at first light. She could be anywhere in a 20-mile radius, Deputy Johnson said, studying a map spread out on Mr. Miller's counter. But if she followed any of the main roads or trails, There are only so many places she could have ended up. They divided the search area into sections, with each team responsible for specific roads, trails, and buildings. The old logging road that led up into the high country was considered one of the less likely possibilities. It was steep and difficult even in good weather, not the kind of path a lost child would likely choose. But Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store and knew every trail in the county, insisted on checking it anyway. Kids don't always make logical choices when they're scared, he pointed out. And if she did make it up that way, there's that old hermit's cabin about 3 miles up. Least we'd know she had shelter. What hermit? Sheriff Davidson asked. You know, that fellow who comes into town sometimes for supplies. Lives up on Pine Mountain somewhere. Keeps to himself, but seems harmless enough. Pays his bills, minds his own business. The sheriff frowned, trying to place the man. Tall guy with a beard. Doesn't say much. That's him. Don't even know his name, but he's been up there for years now. If the little one made it that far, he'd help her for sure. Mountain folks look out for each other. On the third morning, the storm had finally blown itself out, leaving Pine Valley buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. The sky was clear and blindingly blue, and the temperature was starting to rise enough to make travel possible. Search parties set out in all directions, calling the little girl's name and watching for any sign of movement in the white landscape. Grandma Rose wanted to go with them, but the sheriff gently insisted she stay in town in case her granddaughter found her own way home. Tom Bradley and his team started up the old logging road on snowshoes, following what might have been footprints under the fresh snow. The going was slow and difficult, with drifts that reached their waists in places. After an hour of steady climbing, they were beginning to doubt that a small child could have made it this far. Then they saw the smoke. There, Tom pointed through the trees. That's got to be the cabin. They picked up their pace, calling out as they approached. The smoke was rising steady and straight in the still air, a sure sign that someone was home and tending a fire. Meanwhile, up at the cabin, the little girl was helping prepare what had become their morning routine. Pancakes with real maple syrup, coffee for him and warm milk for her, and the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the past few days. Sounds like the storm's finally over, he observed. Looking out the window at the clear sky, she nodded, suddenly realizing that this peaceful time was about to end. Soon she would have to go back to the regular world, back to school and homework and all the noise and rush of normal life. The thought made her a little sad. Will you be all right up here by yourself again? She asked. He paused in his coffee preparation, considering the question seriously. I think so, but it's been nice having company. Reminded me of some things I'd forgotten. Like what? Like how food tastes better when you share it. Like how quiet doesn't have to mean lonely. Before she could respond, they both heard voices outside, men calling her name. She ran to the window and saw several figures in bright winter coats making their way through the snow toward the cabin. Tom Bradley, she exclaimed, recognizing the man in front. And Mr. Peterson from the post office. Her host opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the small porch. The search party looked up at him with a mixture of relief and wariness, grateful to have found the missing child, but uncertain about this reclusive stranger who had been caring for her. She's safe, he called down to them. Been here since the storm started. No harm done. Tom Bradley waved back, his relief evident even from a distance. Thank God. Rose has been worried sick. The whole town's been looking for her. Within minutes, the small cabin was full of people, searchers who had trudged miles through deep snow, their faces red from cold and exertion but lit up with joy at finding the missing child safe and sound. Sweet Pea, Tom Bradley exclaimed, using the nickname the whole town had adopted for her. Your grandma's going to cry when she sees you. We've all been so worried. She looked around at all the familiar faces, these people who had spent days searching for her in dangerous conditions. She felt grateful and guilty at the same time. Grateful for their care, guilty for causing so much worry. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean to get lost. I just went out the back door of the store and couldn't find my way back. Nobody's angry, honey, Mr. Peterson assured her. These things happen. Important thing is you're safe. As the men radioed down to town with the good news, the little girl gathered her few belongings and prepared to leave the place that had been her haven for 3 days. Her host wrapped some leftover bread and soup in a cloth bundle for her to take home. For your grandmother, he said quietly. Tell her thank you for raising such a resourceful young lady. She looked up at him, this kind man who had taken care of her without asking for anything in return. who had taught her things about cooking and life that she would remember forever. "Will I see you again?" she asked. He hesitated, glancing at the search party members who were clearly curious about him, but too polite to ask direct questions. "I don't get to town very often," he said finally. "But you will sometimes?" "Sometimes," he agreed. The trip back down the mountain was easier than the climb up had been. The men had broken a trail on their way up, and going downhill was faster even with the deep snow. The little girl rode on Tom Bradley's shoulders part of the way, looking back occasionally at the cabin that was disappearing behind the trees. When they finally reached the edge of town, it seemed like the entire population of Pine Valley was waiting for them. Grandma Rose stood in the middle of the crowd, her face wet with tears of relief and joy. The reunion was everything the searchers had hoped it would be. Tears and laughter and hugs that lasted forever. Grandma Rose held her granddaughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her small body, hardly able to believe she was really home safe. "I was so scared," the old woman whispered. I was so scared. I'm okay, Grandma. I was never really in danger. There was this man who took care of me, and he taught me things about cooking, and we made bread together." And the words tumbled out of her in an unusual rush, as if 3 days of stored-up conversation were finally finding their way into the world. The crowd listened with amazement, not just to her story, but to the fact that she was talking so much and so freely. "Sounds like you found yourself a guardian angel up there," Sheriff Davidson said with a smile. Later that evening, after the excitement had died down and the house was quiet again, Grandma Rose tucked her granddaughter into her own bed and sat beside her in the lamplight. "Tell me about this man who helped you," she said gently. So the little girl told her everything, about the warm cabin and the simple meals. 2 weeks after the storm, life in Pine Valley had returned to its normal rhythm. The roads were clear, the power lines were repaired, and children were back in school sharing stories of their snow days. But for the little girl, something fundamental had changed during those 3 days on the mountain. She found herself thinking constantly about the quiet man and his peaceful cabin, about the way food had tasted when they cooked it together, about the comfortable silence that had wrapped around them like a warm blanket. School seemed noisier than before, the chatter of her classmates more overwhelming, the busyness of regular life somehow less satisfying. "You're different," Grandma Rose observed one evening as they prepared dinner together. Quieter, but not in a worried way. More settled somehow. The little girl considered this as she stirred a pot of vegetable soup on the stove. "I learned things up there," she said finally. "Not just about cooking, about being peaceful with yourself." Grandma Rose nodded thoughtfully. In the weeks since her granddaughter's return, she'd noticed subtle changes. The child moved with more confidence in the kitchen, seemed more sure of her instincts about seasoning and timing. But it was more than that. She seemed more comfortable in her own skin, less apologetic about her quiet nature. "I keep thinking about him up there all alone," the girl continued. "I know he chose to live by himself, but I think he was lonely. I think maybe he forgot that he liked having someone to cook for." 3 weeks after the storm, the little girl made a decision. "Grandma," she said one Saturday morning, "could we take some supplies up to the man who helped me, just to say thank you properly?" Grandma Rose had been wondering when this request would come. She'd seen her granddaughter looking wistfully toward the mountains, seen her wrapping extra portions of bread or soup as if she was planning to share them with someone who wasn't there. "I think that's a lovely idea, Sweet Pea. What did you have in mind?" They spent the morning preparing a basket of supplies: fresh bread, homemade jam, vegetables from Grandma Rose's root cellar, and a thermos of the vegetable soup that had become the little girl's specialty. As they packed everything carefully, the older woman found herself curious about this mysterious hermit who had made such an impression on her granddaughter. The hike up the old logging road was challenging for Grandma Rose, who wasn't as spry as she used to be. But the little girl led the way with confidence, pointing out landmarks she remembered from her journey down the mountain with the search party. "There," she said finally, pointing through the trees. "You can see the smoke from his chimney." When they reached the cabin, the little girl knocked on the door with the familiar confidence of someone who belonged there. The door opened to reveal the mountain man, looking surprised but genuinely pleased to see her. "Well, hello there," he said with a smile. "I was wondering if I'd ever see you again." "This is my grandma," she said, stepping aside to make introductions. "Grandma Rose, this is, She realized suddenly that she didn't actually know his name. They had spent 3 days together, had shared meals and conversations and comfortable silences, but somehow the topic of names had never come up. "David," he said, extending his hand to Grandma Rose. "David Miller, though I haven't used that name much in recent years." Grandma Rose shook his hand warmly, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. She saw kindness in his eyes and a deep sadness that spoke of old wounds, but nothing that made her worry about her granddaughter's safety. "Rose Peterson," she replied. "I can't thank you enough for taking care of my girl during the storm. When I think about what might have happened if she hadn't found your cabin—" "She took care of herself mostly," David said. "Smart girl. Knew enough to find shelter and wait for help." The little girl was already moving around the cabin with the familiarity of someone who had lived there, setting out the supplies they'd brought and examining his small kitchen to see what had changed since her visit. "You're almost out of flour," she observed, checking his storage containers. "And you don't have any of that good jam Mrs. Patterson makes." David chuckled. "You sound like my grandmother used to, checking my pantry and finding it lacking. Would you like to stay for lunch?" The little girl asked, already pulling ingredients from their basket. "I could show Grandma how you make those pancakes with cornmeal." And so began a tradition that would continue throughout the winter and into spring. Every few weeks, weather permitting, Grandma Rose and her granddaughter would make the trek up the mountain with supplies and news from town. David would share whatever he was cooking, and the little girl would help him prepare meals while Grandma Rose sat by the fire and observed this unlikely friendship with growing fascination. She watched her granddaughter blossom in David's kitchen, saw how he encouraged her natural instincts and taught her techniques that would have taken years to learn elsewhere. But more importantly, she saw how they communicated through their shared work, how they seemed to understand each other without needing many words. "You're good for each other," she told David one afternoon, while her granddaughter was outside gathering firewood. He looked surprised by the direct comment. She reminds me of why I started cooking in the first place, before it became complicated. And what's that? To make people happy. To create something that brings comfort and nourishment. It used to be that simple." Gradually, as winter turned to spring, the visits began to change David's relationship with the wider community. He started appearing in town more often, still quiet and reserved, but no longer completely isolated. When he came to Miller's general store for supplies, the little girl would sometimes be there with her grandmother, and she would greet him with such obvious delight that other townspeople began to see him differently. "That's the man who helped find our missing child," they would whisper to newcomers. "Lives up on the mountain, keeps to himself, but good people." The story of his kindness during the storm had spread throughout Pine Valley, and his mysterious hermit status had transformed into something more respected. He was now seen as a protector, someone who could be trusted to help in times of trouble. By summer, he had become a familiar sight at community events, always standing at the edges but no longer avoiding human contact entirely. The little girl would seek him out at the annual town picnic, bringing him plates of food to try and introducing him to other children who were curious about the quiet man from the mountain. "This is David," she would say with pride. "He taught me how to make bread that rises perfectly every time." Some of the other children began asking questions about cooking, and David found himself sharing simple techniques and recipes with anyone who seemed genuinely interested. He had a natural teaching ability, patient and encouraging, with a way of explaining complex concepts in terms that young minds could understand. "You should teach a cooking class," suggested Mrs. Patterson. One afternoon when she saw him showing a group of children how to properly knead dough at the church. Social, the idea scared him at first. Teaching implied responsibility, expectations, the possibility of disappointment or failure, but the little girl was enthusiastic about the suggestion, and her confidence in his abilities gave him courage. "We could do it at the community center," she said excitedly, "just for kids who really want to learn. You could teach them all the things you taught me." That fall, David began offering informal cooking lessons once a month at the Pine Valley Community Center. The classes were small, never more than 8 or 10 children, and focused on basic skills and simple, nourishing recipes. The little girl served as his unofficial assistant, helping younger children with difficult tasks and sharing her own knowledge with the quiet authority of someone who had learned from a master. The classes were popular with both children and parents. Kids who attended went home excited about cooking, eager to help with family meals and proud of their new skills. Parents appreciated having their children learn practical life skills from someone who clearly knew what he was doing. But for David, the real reward was watching the little girl in her element. She had found her voice in these classes, becoming more talkative and confident as she helped others discover the joy of cooking. She had a natural ability to encourage shy children and to break down complex tasks into manageable steps, and she's going to be an amazing teacher someday, he told Grandma Rose after one particularly successful class. She already is, the older woman replied, watching her granddaughter patiently guide a 6-year-old through the process of measuring flour. You both are. As autumn deepened and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks, David found himself looking forward to the community more than dreading it. The little girl had shown him that it was possible to connect with others without sacrificing the peace he'd found in solitude. She had taught him that sharing his knowledge didn't have to lead to pressure and expectation. It could simply be a gift, freely given and gratefully received. Their friendship had grown into something neither of them had expected when she first knocked on his cabin door during that fierce storm. She had reminded him that food was meant to bring people together, and he had given her the confidence to trust her own instincts and abilities. Spring came early to Pine Valley the following year, with wildflowers blooming on the mountainsides and creeks running full with snowmelt. The little girl, now 9 years old, had grown taller over the winter, but more importantly, she had grown more confident and sure of herself. At school, her teachers noticed the change. She still preferred listening to talking, but when she did speak up, her classmates paid attention. There was something about her quiet authority, especially when discussions turned to practical matters, that commanded respect. She's become a natural leader, her teacher, Mrs. Johnson told Grandma Rose during their spring conference. Not in a loud or demanding way, but other children looked to her for guidance. It's quite remarkable. At home, the little girl had taken over many of the cooking responsibilities, preparing meals with skill that amazed neighbors and family friends. Word had spread throughout the community about her abilities, and people would sometimes ask for her advice on recipes or cooking techniques. That child knows more about food than some adults I know, Mrs. Patterson commented after sampling a loaf of bread the girl had baked entirely on her own. Where did she learn to make crust that flaky? David's monthly cooking classes at the community center had become so popular that he'd started offering sessions for adults as well. What had begun as a simple way to share basic skills had evolved into something much more significant. A gathering place where people came not just to learn about food, but to connect with each other over shared meals and common interests. The little girl remained his dedicated assistant, helping with preparation and cleanup, but also serving as a bridge between David and the community members who were still sometimes intimidated by his quiet manner. She had a gift for making everyone feel welcome and capable no matter their skill level. Watch how she does it, the girl would tell struggling students, demonstrating a technique with patient repetition. Don't worry about making it perfect. Food forgives mistakes if your heart is in the right place. These were words David had spoken to her during their first cooking session together, and hearing them repeated in her young voice always made him smile with pride and something deeper, a sense that what they had built together was lasting, meaningful in ways he was only beginning to understand. One warm April afternoon, as they prepared for an evening cooking class, David made an announcement that surprised even the little girl. I've been thinking, he said, washing vegetables at the community center's sink, about expanding what we're doing here. What do you mean? She asked, carefully arranging wooden spoons and measuring cups on the long tables where students would work. I mean, maybe it's time to think bigger than just classes. Maybe Pine Valley could use something more permanent, something that brings people together around food every day, not just once a month. The little girl stopped what she was doing and looked at him with bright, curious eyes. Like what? Like a restaurant, he said quietly, the words carrying weight because they represented such a dramatic change from the solitary life he'd been living. Nothing fancy, just a place where people could come for good, simple food, where families could have Sunday dinner, where neighbors could meet for coffee and conversation. Her face lit up with excitement. Would Would you want me to help? I couldn't do it without you, he said honestly. You understand this community in ways I'm still learning. And you understand food in ways that can't be taught. You have to be born with it. The idea took root quickly once David began sharing it with other community members. Pine Valley had never had a proper restaurant, and the prospect of having one run by the man who had become known for his excellent cooking classes generated considerable enthusiasm. Within weeks, a group of local business owners and community leaders had formed a committee to help make the restaurant a reality. They found a perfect location, an old building on Main Street that had once housed the town's original general store. With high ceilings, large windows, and a spacious kitchen in back, it seemed designed for their purpose. The renovation became a community project. Volunteers contributed labor, materials, and expertise. The little girl was involved in every aspect of the planning, from choosing paint colors to designing the layout of tables and chairs. It should feel like someone's home, she said during one planning meeting, but big enough that everyone in town could fit if they wanted to. They decided to call it simply the Pine Valley Kitchen, and by late summer, it was ready to open. The dining room was warm and welcoming, with mismatched tables and chairs that gave it a homey feel. The walls were decorated with photographs of local landscapes and community events. The kitchen was visible from the dining area, allowing customers to watch their meals being prepared. David hired 3 part-time employees, all local residents who had attended his cooking classes and shown aptitude for the work. But everyone understood that the little girl, despite her age, was his true partner in the enterprise. She couldn't legally work in the restaurant, of course, but she was there every day after school and during weekends, helping with preparation, greeting customers, and sharing stories about the dishes on the menu. Her presence seemed to put everyone at ease, from nervous first-time diners to busy families looking for a quick, wholesome meal. The menu was exactly what David had promised. Simple, nourishing food prepared with care and attention, fresh bread baked daily, soups that changed with the seasons, vegetables from local gardens, and desserts that reminded people of their childhood favorites. But what made the Pine Valley Kitchen truly special wasn't just the food. It was the atmosphere David and the little girl had created together, a place where conversation flowed naturally, where children were welcome and elderly residents felt comfortable, where the pace of life slowed down enough for people to actually taste their food and enjoy each other's company. It's like eating at a friend's house, regular customers would say, but a friend who happens to be an amazing cook. The little girl thrived in this environment. She loved learning the names and preferences of regular customers, suggesting dishes based on what she knew about their tastes, and making sure everyone felt at home. Her natural shyness hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more like discretion. She observed carefully, spoke thoughtfully, and connected with people in her own quiet way. One evening in late fall, as they cleaned up after a particularly busy dinner service, David reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in the 2 years since a small, lost child had knocked on his cabin door during a fierce storm. "Do you ever miss it?" the little girl asked, as if reading his thoughts. Living alone on the mountain? He considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked something important. "Sometimes I miss the quiet," he admitted, "but I don't miss the loneliness. I didn't even realize how lonely I was until you showed me what it felt like to share meals with someone again." She smiled at that, wiping down tables with the thorough attention to detail that had become her trademark. "Grandma Rose says you saved me during that storm, but I think maybe I saved you too, just in a different way." He looked at her, this remarkable child who had somehow known exactly what he needed to heal from wounds he'd thought were permanent. She had reminded him that cooking wasn't just about technique or presentation or impressing critics. It was about nourishment, both physical and emotional. It was about bringing people together and creating moments of simple happiness. "You know what I think?" he said, echoing words she had spoken to him during their first days together. "What?" she asked, hanging up her dish rag and giving him her full attention. "I think we both found exactly what we needed that night. You needed someone who understood that quiet doesn't mean broken, and I needed someone to remind me that food is love made visible." The Pine Valley Kitchen became more than just a restaurant. It became the heart of the community. On Sunday afternoons, families would gather for long, leisurely meals while children played in the small courtyard behind the building. On weekday mornings, the coffee counter became an informal meeting place where neighbors shared news and made plans. The little girl continued to grow in confidence and skill. By her 10th birthday, she could prepare most of the restaurant's dishes independently and had developed a reputation throughout the county for her exceptional abilities. Food critics from the city occasionally made the drive to Pine Valley, drawn by word-of-mouth reports about the remarkable young cook working alongside the mysterious mountain chef. But she remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. She still preferred listening to talking, still found peace in the rhythmic work of chopping vegetables or kneading dough. She treated every customer with the same quiet courtesy, whether they were wealthy tourists or local. Farmers coming in for a simple lunch. That child has wisdom, beyond her years, the town doctor observed after watching her calm a fussy toddler by letting him help stir pancake batter. She understands people in a way that can't be taught. David often marveled at the path his life had taken. The restaurant that had begun as a way to stay connected to the community had become his life's work. Not just a business, but a calling. He cooked now not for critics or reviews, but for the satisfaction of seeing families enjoy meals together.